I shouldn't have left home that night. The forecast was clear, a severe snowstorm was on its way, but I convinced myself I could reach my destination before it got worse. I was driving down an empty road, with no cell signal and snow piling up quickly on my windshield. My visibility was shrinking, and the car started to skid on some of the curves. That's when I realized I was completely lost. After hours of trying to find my way back, I saw something ahead, a man standing next to a truck, waving at me. I pulled over beside him, relieved to finally see another person. He looked sturdy, dressed in a heavy jacket and a beanie that partially obscured his face. "Need some help?" he asked with a smile that, at first glance, seemed friendly. I explained my situation, and he suggested I follow him. "I know this area well. I can take you somewhere safe until the storm passes." Something about his voice was reassuring, and without thinking too much, I agreed. I started the car and began following him down the snow-covered road. At first, everything seemed fine. The truck ahead of me moved confidently, while I struggled to keep control of the wheel. But after a while, I noticed that he wasn't following a logical route. The road grew narrower, surrounded by dense trees, with no lights or signs of a town nearby. I tried honking to get him to stop, but he only sped up, as if he wanted to lead me farther away from civilization. My heart began to race. Something felt very wrong. I decided I needed to stop and turn back, but before I could act, he braked abruptly, forcing me to do the same. I stepped out of the car, shivering in the biting cold, and asked why we had stopped. He got out of the truck, his smile no longer friendly. "The road ends here," he said, gesturing toward the emptiness ahead. All I could see was a field of snow and darkness. "But you can stay the night with me. I've got a place nearby." Every instinct I had screamed at me to refuse. With each word he spoke, an overwhelming sense of danger crept over me. I politely declined, saying I'd rather return to the main road. He chuckled, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down my spine. "There's no going back. This snow will swallow you up before you even make it halfway." When I tried to return to my car, he blocked my path. That's when I noticed something glinting in his hand, a knife. My blood ran cold. "You trust people too easily," he said, stepping closer. "That's how I always find the ones I need out here." Without thinking, I shoved him and ran back to the car. He yelled something after me, but the sound was drowned out by the howling wind. I locked the doors and tried to start the engine, but the car wouldn't respond. He started banging on the window, laughing, while I frantically turned the key. It wasn't until he tried smashing the glass with the handle of the knife that the engine finally roared to life. I floored the gas pedal, the car sliding on the snow but somehow managing to pull away. I drove aimlessly for hours, the snow falling so heavily I could barely see. Eventually, I spotted lights on the horizon, a small gas station. I pulled in quickly, nearly crashing into the entrance. Inside, I explained everything to the attendant, who listened with a grim expression. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "We've heard stories about a man like that for years, but no one knows who he really is. The people who run into him, well, most don't live to tell the tale." Even now, when I think back to that night, I get chills. His smile, the knife in his hand, and the feeling that I was on the brink of something horrific have never left me. I don't know how I managed to escape, but one thing is certain, I'll never trust a stranger on a deserted road again, no matter how desperate I am. Ski vacations always seemed like the perfect idea for me and my wife, Anna. We chose a secluded cabin in the mountains, surrounded by fresh snow and silence. It was the kind of place that promised relaxation and a little adventure. On the first night, we met our neighbors in the cabin next door, a lively group of friends who had brought boxes of beer and a guitar. One of them, Daniel, was the most outgoing. He invited us over to their cabin, but we were exhausted from the trip and politely declined. We had no idea that would be the last time we'd see Daniel. The next morning, something felt off. The group in the neighboring cabin was unusually quiet, and we noticed that one of their cars was gone. What really caught our attention, though, was that the lights in their cabin had been on all night, something we only realized when we looked out the window at dawn. Over breakfast, Anna mentioned that she hadn't heard any music or laughter during the night, just heavy footsteps in the snow, pacing back and forth outside. Maybe they were just tired or left early to go skiing, I suggested, trying to shake off the unease. But as the day went on, it became clear something wasn't right. While we were on the ski lift, we noticed tracks in the snow around the neighboring cabin. It looked like someone had dragged something large into the woods behind the building. When we returned to our cabin, Anna couldn't stop thinking about it. "What if they need help?" she asked. Reluctantly, I agreed to check on them. We went to their cabin and knocked on the door. A woman answered, looking visibly nervous. "Everything's fine," she said quickly, barely cracking the door open. But her eyes betrayed her fear. That night, we heard low voices coming from their cabin, like they were arguing. We decided the only way to ease our concern was to investigate. Bundled up in our jackets, with a flashlight in hand, we headed to the woods where we had seen the tracks earlier. We followed them until we reached a small clearing. In the center was a mound of snow that looked hastily piled. When Anna shone the flashlight on it, we saw a piece of red fabric partially buried. It was Daniel's jacket. My heart raced. We started digging through the snow with our hands, as fast as we could, but before we could uncover much, we heard footsteps behind us. Turning around, we saw two of Daniel's friends watching us. One of them held a shovel. "What are you doing here?" one asked, his tone calm, almost eerily so. "Where's Daniel?" Anna demanded, her voice shaking. The man with the shovel took a step closer and smiled. "You should head back to your cabin. Now." Without hesitation, we ran back to our cabin. We locked all the doors and turned off the lights, trying to convince ourselves we were safe. But at midnight, we heard something scraping against the living room window. When we looked, one of Daniel's friends was standing outside, his face partially illuminated by the moonlight. He was motionless, holding the shovel. My blood ran cold as he tapped lightly on the glass and smiled. "You shouldn't meddle in things that don't concern you," he said before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, we left without looking back. We didn't tell anyone what happened until we were miles away. Later, we learned that the police found Daniel's body in the clearing where we had been digging. The official story was that he had an accident and died trying to get help in the snow. But we know the truth. We know Daniel was betrayed by his own friends. And the most chilling part? We know they're still out there, hiding their secrets beneath the snow. I needed isolation. After a stressful year at work and a difficult breakup, all I wanted was peace. That's why I rented a remote cabin in the mountains for the winter. The description was perfect: cozy, secluded, and surrounded by snow. When I arrived, the view was as breathtaking as I had imagined. The silence was almost tangible, and the only sound was the wind blowing through the trees. I finally felt at peace. But that tranquility wouldn't last long. On the first night, I heard faint noises coming from downstairs. I didn't think much of it. The cabin was old, and old wood always creaks. But the next morning, I noticed something strange: the kitchen door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. On top of that, a few cans of food I'd brought were out of place. I convinced myself that I must have left it like that without realizing, but the doubt began to gnaw at me. On the second night, I woke up to a more distinct sound: footsteps downstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and went down, trying to calm myself while repeating that it was just my imagination. Everything seemed in place, but when I looked at the fireplace, I noticed something odd. The ashes, which I had cleaned before bed, were scattered as if someone had rummaged through them. And there were footprints in the soot, leading to the door. This time, I was alarmed. I spent the day checking every lock and window in the cabin, trying to find any sign of a break-in, but there was nothing. No broken windows, no forced doors. That night, I wedged a chair against my bedroom door and left the bedside lamp on. Even so, I woke up in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling of being watched. The room was silent, but when I looked at the mirror near the bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold, finger marks in the dust, as if someone had run their hand across it. The next morning, I found something even more disturbing. On the kitchen floor, there was a small pile of melted snow. That could only mean someone had come inside from the outside during the night. I decided I had had enough. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but, as expected, there was no signal. I needed to leave, but the snowstorm that had started overnight had blocked the road. I was trapped. That night, the noise was clearer than ever. Someone was coming up the stairs. I grabbed a kitchen knife and braced myself to confront the intruder. The door to my room creaked open slowly, and I saw a shadow in the hallway. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. I turned on the flashlight and shone it into the hallway, empty. But on the floor, there were footprints in the dust, leading right to my door. The following day, I found something that nearly broke me. On the small table in the living room, someone had left a folded piece of paper. When I opened it, the short message was enough to freeze my blood: "You're in my house." I don't know how, but that afternoon, I managed to escape. I grabbed a few things and forced myself to trek through the snow until I found help. When I finally reached the nearest town, the owner of the cabin looked bewildered. "You're the first person to rent that cabin in years," he said. "Not since the last tenant disappeared." I grew up in a small town surrounded by forests and mountains, where winter seemed to last forever. Everyone knew each other, and the kind of tragedy you'd hear about in big cities never happened here. That changed last winter when a girl named Laura disappeared. She was 16, popular, full of life, the kind of person everyone liked. On the day she vanished, she was walking home from a friend's house. The last time anyone saw her was when a neighbor spotted her entering a trail that cut through the woods to her house. She never made it. The entire town came together. Search parties combed through the forest and trails, but the heavy snow had erased any trace she might have left behind. With no cell signal and no witnesses, it was as if Laura had vanished into thin air. For weeks, the searches continued, but each passing day brought more despair and less hope. When spring came, the search parties disbanded, and the town slowly tried to move on. But for me, something never felt right. I knew that trail well, I walked it nearly every day. How could someone simply disappear there? Months later, during the thaw, a group of fishermen stumbled upon something strange in a frozen swamp a few miles from the trail. It was a set of footprints that seemed to appear out of nowhere, crossing the icy surface of the swamp and ending abruptly in the middle. The news spread quickly, and soon the police cordoned off the area. Like many other residents, I went to see it for myself, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. The footprints were small, about the size of a teenager's feet. They didn't come from anywhere, there was no starting point. It was as if Laura had materialized out of thin air and walked to the center of the swamp. The police began dredging the swamp but found nothing, just ice, mud, and animal remains. It wasn't until one of the officers decided to search the surrounding area that they made a truly disturbing discovery. They found an opening in the ground, hidden beneath fallen branches and stones. It was a narrow cave, and the air coming from it was icy and foul. Inside, they found clothing that matched what Laura had been wearing the day she disappeared. Hanging from a branch at the cave's entrance was a necklace everyone knew belonged to her. But the most unsettling discovery was at the back of the cave, markings on the walls. They were symbols no one could identify, drawn with what appeared to be a mixture of charcoal and dried blood. The town was gripped by fear. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was the work of an old cult that, according to local legends, performed rituals in the forest. Others believed Laura had been lured into the cave by someone, or something, that was still there. What truly happened that night remains a mystery. The police eventually closed the case as an unsolved disappearance, but for me and many others, the answers lay in that cave and the frozen swamp. To this day, no one dares walk that trail alone, especially in winter. And when the snow blankets the ground, some swear they still see footprints leading to the swamp, footprints that start from nowhere and vanish on the ice, just like Laura. It was one of those nights when winter felt endless. The wind howled outside, and the snow hit the windows like tiny shards of ice. My wife, Clara, and I were sitting in the living room, trying to enjoy the warmth of the fireplace, while our 2 kids slept upstairs. It was the kind of night that called for staying in, but something about the storm's intensity made me uneasy. Maybe it was the oppressive silence between the gusts of wind. I didn't know it then, but that night was about to become unforgettable. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. Clara heard it too. It was muffled, almost rhythmic, and it was coming from above us. Footsteps on the roof. At first, I thought it might be the snow shifting or maybe an animal, but the longer we listened, the clearer it became that it was something, or someone, walking up there. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. Clara, already nervous, insisted it was probably just the wind. But I knew better. I decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed to the attic, which sat just below the roof. The sound continued, but it was more distant now, as if whoever, or whatever, it was had moved across the length of the roof. The attic was dark and quiet, but something was off. The small window that led outside was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it before the storm. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. Clara screamed, and I ran to find her clutching our children in the living room, trembling with fear. "The kitchen door," she said. When I went to check, I saw that the lock had been forced. The snow piled outside made it clear someone had entered. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and relocked the door, but now the sound from the roof had stopped, leaving an even more terrifying silence. We decided to lock ourselves in the master bedroom, bringing the kids with us. We were in the middle of a whispered debate about what to do when we heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever was there knew exactly where they wanted to go. I gripped the knife tightly, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. Clara tried to calm the kids, but her eyes betrayed the same fear I was feeling. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. The handle began to turn slowly, and I knew I had no choice. I flung the door open, knife raised, and came face to face with a tall man wearing a heavy coat dusted with snow. He was holding a gun. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His eyes were cold and calculating. "Don't do anything stupid," he said, his voice low and firm. I don't know what gave me the courage, but in a moment of desperation, I shouted for Clara to take the kids and escape through the window. The commotion was enough to distract the man for a split second, and I lunged at him, trying to disarm him. There was a brief but intense struggle, and the gun went off, the deafening sound filling the house. Somehow, I managed to knock him down and wrest the gun from his grip. He scrambled to his feet and fled through the attic window he must have used to enter, disappearing into the storm. The police arrived hours later, after the storm had eased. They found footprints around the house and tracks leading back into the forest. The intruder was never caught, but the officers told us there had been reports of an armed man breaking into homes in the area. To this day, I don't know what he wanted, but one thing is certain: we've never slept soundly during a snowstorm again. Daniel and I had always been close. After months of work-related stress, we decided we deserved a break. We found an isolated cabin in a snowy mountain region, the perfect place to unwind, far from the chaos of the city. We arrived just before a major snowstorm, prepared to disconnect from the world for a few days. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a fireplace that warmed the space and a view of a forest that looked like something out of a postcard. At first, everything seemed perfect. The snowstorm hit hard on the first night, relentless and heavy. By morning, the snow had blanketed nearly everything around us. We decided to take a short walk before the temperatures dropped even further. During our trek, we stumbled upon a car partially buried in the snow about 300 yards from the cabin. The vehicle looked abandoned, its doors locked, and the windows covered in a thin layer of ice. Curious, Daniel wiped the side window and peered inside. There was no one there, but the driver's seat was stained with what looked like blood. We returned to the cabin, unsettled. There was no sign of anyone else in the area, and the road was completely impassable due to the snow. Whoever owned the car wasn't nearby, and the idea of someone wandering out there in those conditions didn't make sense. We decided to lock all the doors and windows, but the unease lingered. Daniel tried to lighten the mood with a joke about horror movies, but neither of us laughed. Night fell, and the howling wind outside took on an even more sinister tone. Around midnight, while we were playing cards near the fireplace, we heard something that made our hearts race, footsteps crunching in the snow. The sound came from outside, slow and deliberate. We rushed to turn off the lights and peered out the window, straining to see through the darkness. At first, we saw nothing, but then Daniel pointed toward the edge of the forest. There was a figure standing there, motionless, just watching the cabin. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. We decided not to make any sudden moves. We grabbed a kitchen knife and a flashlight to feel a little safer. Hours passed in silence as we remained on edge, but by dawn, the figure had vanished. In the morning, we went outside to investigate. We found footprints in the snow circling the cabin, some disturbingly close to the windows. Even more unsettling, the footprints didn't lead to the forest. They started near the cabin itself, as if the person had already been there before the storm. Paranoia began to take hold. We spent the day trying to find some way to call for help, but the phone had no signal, and the road was still blocked. That night, we heard noises again, but this time they came from the roof. Summoning some courage, I stepped outside to shine the flashlight on the roof. There was nothing there. But when I went back inside, we found something that made my blood run cold. On the fogged-up glass of one of the windows, someone had written the word "leave" with their finger. That was it for us. We spent the rest of the night wide awake, every sound amplifying our fear. When the storm finally eased the next day, we decided to abandon the cabin on foot, knowing it would be a long and dangerous trek to the main road. As we trudged through the snow, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the cabin's porch, staring directly at us. It wasn't a hallucination. That confirmed our worst fears. We had never been alone. We never found out who it was or what they wanted. The police located the abandoned car, but it wasn't registered in any system. As for the cabin, I've never gone back, nor do I intend to. The silence of that place, which once felt peaceful, is now a sound that chills me to my core every time I hear the wind howl. It was supposed to be just another late-night delivery. Snow began falling as soon as I left the last town behind, but I was used to driving in tough conditions. My cargo was simple, boxes of supplies for a small, isolated mountain village. The road was deserted, and the quiet of the snowstorm made the world feel even more solitary. With the radio out of signal and the wind pounding against the windshield, it was easy to drift into my thoughts. That's when my headlights illuminated something on the shoulder ahead. At first, I thought it was just a branch or some debris from a car. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was tied up, his hands and feet bound, and he appeared unconscious. His clothes were covered in snow, and his face had a bluish tint, suggesting he had been out there for some time. I stopped the truck immediately and jumped out, ignoring the biting cold. I untied him as quickly as I could and brought him into the cab, cranking the heater to full blast. He was weak, but still breathing. As I tried to warm him up, his eyes flickered open briefly, and he mumbled something I could barely make out. "They're coming." I asked who they were, but he passed out again before he could respond. My gut told me to get out of there as fast as possible, so I got back on the road. I tried calling the police, but as expected, there was no signal. All I could do was drive and pray I'd find help in the next village. It didn't take long before I realized we were being followed. In the rearview mirror, I saw the headlights of a vehicle gaining on us quickly, an unusual sight on such a deserted road during a snowstorm. The headlights swerved erratically, as if the driver was trying to intimidate me or force me to stop. I accelerated, doing my best to keep some distance, but the truck was heavy, and the icy road was unforgiving. Eventually, the vehicle pulled alongside me. It was a dark pickup with tinted windows. One of the windows rolled down, and I saw the glint of something metallic, a gun. They fired at the rear tires, and I felt the truck lose control. I managed to steer it away from a complete crash, but I slid onto a side road that wasn't on my map. The pickup stopped on the main road but didn't immediately follow. I used the moment to check on the man, who was still unconscious in the passenger seat. The cold was brutal, and I knew we couldn't stay there for long. While I debated my next move, I heard voices. Turning around, I saw two figures emerging from the pickup, walking slowly toward me. One of them held a gun, and the other carried something that looked like a crowbar. It was clear they were willing to do whatever it took to reclaim the man. I grabbed the tire iron I always kept in the truck and braced myself. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. As they approached, the man with the gun shouted, "This doesn't concern you. Hand him over and walk away." My heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't just give him up. "You left him to die," I shouted back. The man smirked, a cold, emotionless grin. "He knows things he shouldn't. And now, so do you." Before they could make their move, the distant sound of a police siren broke through the storm. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was enough to make them hesitate. They retreated to their truck, casting one last threatening glance before disappearing into the darkness. I don't know where that police car came from, but it was my saving grace. Shortly after, I managed to get a cell signal and called for help. The man I rescued was taken to a hospital, and I later learned he was an accountant who had uncovered a massive criminal operation involving millions of dollars. He had been trying to expose it when he was kidnapped. The police launched an investigation, but the kidnappers were never found. Since that night, I've avoided driving in snowstorms and often think about the phrase he murmured, "They're coming." Deep down, I can't shake the feeling that this story isn't over. Living alone was always a choice for me. My house stood isolated, perched on a hill surrounded by trees and silence. On that frigid winter night, the wind howled, and snow blanketed everything in sight. I was preparing a cup of tea when I heard a knock at the door. Visitors were rare, especially in such a remote location, and the knocks were firm but not frantic. When I opened the door, I found a man standing there, barefoot and dressed only in a thin shirt and worn-out pants. He was shivering, but his eyes were intense, almost hypnotic. "I need help," he said, his voice raspy. Instinctively, I offered him shelter. Leaving him outside in that temperature was unthinkable. He stepped in hesitantly, but something about his demeanor felt off, almost rehearsed. I grabbed a blanket and a mug of hot tea, trying to ignore the growing discomfort inside me. "What happened to you?" I asked as he sat near the fireplace. He only shook his head, avoiding the question. Slowly, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Despite his shivering, he didn't seem truly cold. His hands were oddly clean, showing no signs of trudging through the snow. But what unsettled me the most was the silence as he moved. No creak from the wooden floor, no sound of boots crunching through the snow, though he wasn't wearing any. When I tried making small talk, he deflected with short, emotionless responses. The only thing he asked was, "Are you here alone?" At that moment, every alarm in my head went off. I made an excuse, saying I needed something from another room, but instead, I went to the kitchen to grab a knife. When I returned, he was no longer by the fireplace. The blanket was tossed on the floor, still folded as I had given it to him. I called out his name, but the house was eerily silent. Then I noticed the front door was open, snow slowly creeping in through the doorway. Before I could approach it, I heard a noise upstairs, a slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. It wasn't the sound of someone climbing the stairs but rather pacing back and forth. Summoning every ounce of courage, I gripped the knife tightly, my hand aching from the pressure, and began to climb the stairs. As I reached the hallway, the lights began to flicker, and the air grew heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. I opened the bedroom door, and my grip on the knife faltered. The man was standing by the window, his back to me, staring out into the darkness. His back was bare, and I saw marks on his skin, deep scratches that looked freshly healed. "You shouldn't have opened the door," he said without turning around. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to ask what he wanted. Then he finally turned, and the face I saw wasn't the same as before. His skin appeared translucent, and his eyes were black and hollow, like endless voids. I ran. Nothing else mattered but getting out of that house. I stumbled down the stairs, flung open the front door, and dashed into the snow, feeling the icy wind sting my face. I ran without looking back until I reached the main road. Somehow, a truck appeared, and the driver, seeing my frantic state, stopped to help. When I told him what had happened, he just shook his head and said, "You're not the first to mention something like this. You shouldn't open the door for anyone, especially during a snowstorm." To this day, I don't know who or what that man was, but I've never returned to that house. And every time I hear a knock on the door during a cold night, no matter where I am, the fear creeps back in. I always knew the mountains held their mysteries, but nothing could have prepared me for what we experienced on that expedition. We were 5 seasoned mountaineers, ready to conquer a remote peak that few dared to climb. The plan was to spend 3 nights at the base camp before beginning our ascent. The first night was uneventful. We set up our tents, divided supplies, and discussed the route. The silence around us was absolute, broken only by the wind cutting through the valley. But when the sun rose, we noticed something none of us could explain. Footprints. They were scattered around our tents, fresh and sharply defined. They weren't ours, they were larger and oddly shaped, with elongated toes that pressed deeply into the snow. We debated the possibilities, perhaps some animal or even another group of climbers who didn't want to reveal themselves. But something didn't add up. The footprints started and ended in the middle of the snow, with no tracks leading to or away from them. That night, the wind grew stronger, making the tent sway violently. Sleeping was difficult, but eventually, exhaustion took over. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something dragging itself outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening to slow, heavy footsteps passing nearby. I waited until dawn to tell the others, but when I stepped out of the tent, I realized something was wrong. One of us was missing. Carlos, our most experienced guide, had vanished, leaving behind only his open tent and footprints leading away from camp. The group was in panic. We divided tasks. 2 stayed at the camp while I and another teammate, Miguel, followed Carlos's footprints. They snaked through the snow, climbing toward a rocky outcrop. When we reached the top, the footprints simply stopped, as if he had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues as to where he could have gone. We returned to camp with the unsettling feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. On the third night, we fortified the camp as best we could, but fear was etched into everyone's faces. In the middle of the night, I was woken by screams. Rushing out of the tent, I saw Miguel pointing toward the edge of the camp, terrified. A tall, hooded figure stood there, watching us in the darkness. Before I could react, it disappeared into the snow, moving with unnerving speed. This time, we found deep impressions in the ice, but no tracks to indicate where it had come from or where it had gone. By morning, another member of the group was gone. Only Miguel and I remained. We decided we couldn't stay another night. As we packed up the camp, a distant sound reached us, a muffled scream echoing from the mountains. Miguel froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his face pale. I could only nod. The sound was strange, almost human, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. As night fell, we prepared to descend, but it was too late. Miguel vanished while I was inside the tent organizing the remaining supplies. I was alone, surrounded by an oppressive silence. The wind carried whispers, words I couldn't understand. I had no choice. With a flashlight and the little courage I had left, I started descending the mountain alone. I never saw Miguel again. When I finally reached the base of the mountain, I reported everything to the local authorities, but no one believed me. They said the extreme conditions could play tricks on the mind, that perhaps the altitude had caused hallucinations. But I know what I saw. And I know that up there, in the shadow of the mountains, something is still waiting. My town was never very busy, especially in the winter. Surrounded by mountains with a lake at its center, the place seemed to freeze along with the snow that piled up every year. But nothing could have prepared the residents for what they called the storm of the century. For 3 days, no one left their homes. The snow covered roads, windows, and even the lake, which was already completely frozen. When the storm finally passed, the first to venture out were the fishermen, who used the ice to set their traps. One of them was the first to find the body. It was a man, frozen beneath the ice of the lake. At first, people thought he might have been a drifter caught off guard by the storm, but it didn't take long to realize something was off. He was perfectly positioned under the surface, as if someone had gone to great lengths to place him there. The police arrived quickly, but few residents believed the case would ever be solved. In small towns like ours, secrets tend to be buried under the snow, just like everything else. I was there when they pulled the body out. The man's face was strange, frozen in an expression of agony. He wasn't from around here, that much was clear. But when the police searched his pockets, they found something that changed everything, a detailed map of the town, with several houses marked, including mine. Seeing my address circled in red marker sent a chill down my spine. Nobody knew who he was or why he had that map, but the silence among the gathered crowd made it clear that many people had something to hide. As the investigation unfolded, rumors began to swirl. Some said the man was a private investigator, hired to take a closer look at the lives of the townspeople. Others believed he was a reporter, digging for dirt on the town. Tensions rose, and the sheriff, who had known us all forever, seemed more concerned with who knew what than with uncovering the truth. That's when an older woman, Mrs. Martha, made a comment that froze the air as much as the snow. This is because of the club. The club was something people rarely spoke about openly. It was said to be a secret society made up of some of the town's more influential residents. No one knew exactly what they did, but whispers of blackmail, bribery, and even murder circulated in hushed conversations. It was the sort of thing you didn't really believe but didn't dare question either. When people started asking questions about the map, it became clear that every house marked on it was tied to members of this so-called club. The autopsy revealed that the man hadn't died from the cold. He had been strangled, and his body had been placed in the lake before the storm hit, ensuring the blizzard would cover any evidence. The question was, who did it, and why? One night, while watching the snow fall outside my window, I heard footsteps outside my house. When I looked, I saw a hooded figure standing in the street, still, watching me. My heart raced, and when I went to the door, no one was there. Only footprints, fading into the snow. The days that followed were filled with silence. The police closed the case as unsolved, but we all knew the answers were among us. It didn't take long for people to start leaving town. Some said it was because of the cold, others blamed the economy, but I knew the truth. They were running. Today, the town is nearly empty, but the lake remains, silent and frozen, as if guarding secrets that will never be uncovered. And sometimes, when the ice is thin enough, they say you can still see a dark shadow just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. Working as a forest ranger in a remote reserve had always been a peaceful job. I knew every trail, every stream, and even where the animals liked to hide. Most of my duties involved ensuring tourists followed the rules and protecting the ecosystem. But that afternoon, during my usual patrol, something unusual caught my attention. A thin plume of smoke was rising between the trees in an area where camping was strictly prohibited. I decided to investigate. After walking for a few minutes, I found the campsite. It was makeshift, with a worn-out tent and a poorly extinguished fire. As I approached, I saw a man sitting by the fire, his hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the ground. He looked tired, almost drained. "You know you're not allowed to camp here, right?" I said, keeping my tone firm but friendly. He slowly lifted his head, and for the first time, our eyes met. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a mix of fear and desperation that made me uneasy. "I just need one more day," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Then I'll leave." I explained that I couldn't let him stay, but before I could say more, he raised his hands, as if trying to calm me down. "You don't understand. I can't leave yet. They're looking for me." That caught me off guard. "Who's looking for you?" I asked, trying to make sense of the situation. He hesitated before answering, as though carefully choosing his words. "People who don't want me to talk about what I know." Instinct told me something was seriously wrong, but before I could press him further, we both heard a sound in the distance. It was subtle but unmistakable, footsteps. Not the kind made by animals. Someone was approaching. The man saw my expression and immediately became alert. "You brought them here," he whispered, his tone accusatory. Before I could respond, he stomped out the remaining embers of the fire with his boot and began frantically dismantling the tent. "If you want to live, you need to leave. Now," he said, his voice trembling. I should have followed protocol and called for backup, but something about his behavior made me hesitate. I decided to stay and see what was happening. It didn't take long for the footsteps to get closer, and then we saw them, two men dressed in heavy outdoor gear, carrying rifles. They moved deliberately, with the precision of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. When they saw us, they stopped, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. "Hand him over," one of them said, pointing his rifle in our direction. I tried to reason with them, pointing out that they were in a protected area and carrying weapons illegally, but the man beside me cut me off. "They won't listen to you. They're just here to kill me." Before I could react, he took off running, leaving me frozen with fear. The two men chased after him without hesitation, and I did what any responsible ranger would do, I followed. The chase led us to a narrow ravine where the man finally stopped. He was cornered, with the two armed men blocking any way back. As I approached, I heard enough to piece together what was happening. "He saw everything," one of the men said. "If he talks, we're finished." That's when the man turned to me and said something I'll never forget: "They killed people. Women. Children. And I know where the bodies are." Before the men could pull the trigger, a gust of wind swept through the ravine, and the distant sound of sirens echoed. "Back up." I'd managed to send a distress signal during the chase. The men panicked and fled, leaving the man behind. He was taken into custody, and in the days that followed, he revealed information that led to a nationwide investigation. The 2 men were arrested, and the case exposed a network of horrifying crimes involving powerful individuals. I never learned all the details of what he witnessed, but from that day on, I never saw my job the same way. The forest, which had once been my haven of peace, became a place where the darkest secrets could be hidden, but sometimes, the truth finds a way to emerge. That winter was relentless. The snow fell endlessly, and the icy wind burned our skin. My friends and I were returning from a ski trip when our car broke down in the middle of nowhere. With no cell signal and no houses in sight, we started walking along the road, hoping to find some shelter. After nearly an hour of battling the cold, we spotted the silhouette of an abandoned train station. It seemed like our only option. The station was in ruins, with broken windows and graffiti covering the outer walls. The platform was blanketed in snow, and the wind made the doors creak. Inside, we found what appeared to be the old waiting room. It was freezing, but at least it shielded us from the wind. The only light came from our flashlights and the faint glow of the moon filtering through dirty glass panes. We huddled in a corner to warm up and figure out our next move. That's when we heard the first sound. It was faint, like something being dragged across the floor. We thought it might just be the wind pushing around some old debris, but when we followed the sound with our flashlights, there was nothing there. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease, but the silence that followed was oppressive, as if the building itself was watching us. Then Lucas, one of our group, spoke up, "Did you hear that? I think there's someone outside." We rushed to the door to check, but the snow outside was untouched. No footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. We tried to convince ourselves it was just paranoia, but the sound returned, this time closer, like footsteps echoing down a corridor. We decided to investigate, splitting into 2 groups. Anna and I took the left side of the station, while Lucas and Clara stayed behind. As Anna and I moved further in, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The hallway was lined with rusted lockers and broken benches. One door caught our attention, it was marked with scratches that looked fresh. When we opened it, we found an empty room, except for a pile of clothes. They appeared to belong to several people, tossed together haphazardly. Dark stains marked the fabric, and the metallic smell of blood filled the air. Anna began trembling, and not just from the cold. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice shaky. We hurried back to find Lucas and Clara, but they were gone. Their backpacks were still there, but there was no trace of them. Then we heard a distant, muffled scream from somewhere deep within the station. We ran toward the sound, but the building felt like a maze, with doors leading to endless corridors. Every step we took echoed unnaturally, as if we weren't alone. Finally, we found Clara crouched in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "Lucas, he was taken," she stammered. Before we could ask anything, we heard footsteps behind us, fast and heavy. We shone our flashlights down the hall and saw a figure moving in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by what looked like a crude mask. The figure said nothing, but it advanced slowly, holding something shiny in its hand, a tool that was somewhere between a knife and a hook. We ran to the main hall, but the figure kept following, closing the distance with every step. We managed to escape the station and sprint into the snow, the biting cold and slippery ground threatening to slow us down. I never dared to look back, but I could hear the footsteps and heavy breathing, as if it was right behind me. Eventually, we reached the road and saw headlights in the distance. It was a truck. We stumbled into its path, desperate, and the driver stopped just in time to save us. When we told him what had happened, the man shook his head grimly. That station's been abandoned for decades. People say some things linger there, but not many live to talk about it. We returned later with authorities, but Lucas was never found. To this day, I avoid abandoned places, especially in winter. Because in that station, something, or someone, is still waiting in the shadows. My passion for amateur radios started as a hobby. In a small, isolated town, it was my way of hearing the outside world. That night, I was tuning frequencies, catching scattered conversations, when something made me stop. It was a woman's voice, low and filled with desperation. "Someone, please, help me. I'm trapped." The message repeated a few times before fading into static. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't common to hear distress calls over the radio. Something was wrong. I rushed to tell my friend Jonah, who was also passionate about radios and knew the area well. He came over, and together, we tried to pick up the signal again. After a few minutes, the voice returned, weaker this time. We managed to catch only a few words: "Cabin, near the lake, they're here." That was all we needed to know. There was a lake about 10 miles from town, surrounded by a few cabins, most of them vacant during winter. We gathered 3 more locals, grabbed flashlights and weapons, and drove to the lake. The road was narrow, and heavy snow made the journey difficult. When we arrived, the cabins were dark and silent, except for one. Faint lights glowed inside, accompanied by the distant sound of old music playing on a radio. Our group hesitated. Whoever was inside didn't seem to be in danger, but the voice on the radio was clear. We decided to investigate. On the porch of the cabin, there were signs of a struggle, footprints in the snow, dark stains that looked like blood, and a spilled suitcase with clothes scattered everywhere. Jonah knocked on the door, but there was no response. When we pushed it, the door creaked open. Inside, the cabin was eerily silent, save for the radio tuned to a station playing old jazz. The place smelled metallic and sickly, turning my stomach. That's when we saw what was on the floor. There was a large, fresh bloodstain and drag marks leading to another room. We followed the trail to the back door, but before we could open it, we heard footsteps behind us. Turning around, we saw a tall man dressed in heavy clothing, his expression blank. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice cold and menacing. Jonah tried to explain that we'd heard a distress call, but the man just smiled, a smile that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come." He lunged at us, but Jonah managed to hold him off, and the others helped subdue him. Meanwhile, I went to the back room, where the blood trail led. Opening the door, I found a small room dimly lit by a single hanging bulb. In the corner was a woman, tied up, her face bruised and her eyes wide with fear. "Please, get me out of here," she whispered. I rushed to untie her while the others kept the man restrained. We called the police, who took over an hour to arrive due to the distance and the snowstorm. The woman, Helena, shared a horrifying story. She was a tourist who had stopped in town to rest before continuing her trip. The man had kidnapped her while she was refueling her car, dragging her to the cabin. When he left for a few minutes, she had managed to turn on the radio to the wrong frequency, hoping someone would hear her. Thankfully, we did. The police arrested the man, but the investigation uncovered something even darker. The cabin wasn't just the site of her abduction. Evidence inside linked the man to multiple disappearances in the region. For years, he had used the abandoned cabins around the lake as hideouts for his crimes. Since that night, I can't tune into a radio without hearing Helena's voice calling for help. Knowing we answered that call brings some relief, but it's a stark reminder that evil often hides closer than we think, lurking in quiet, forgotten places. Driving a taxi at night was never easy, but winter made it even harder. The roads were dangerously slick, and passengers were few and far between. That night, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the city, and I was debating whether to end my shift early when my radio crackled with a last-minute request. The pickup point was near the city center. I hesitated but figured it could be my final fare for the night. When I arrived, a man stood on the sidewalk, almost hidden beneath a heavy coat and a hood that obscured most of his face. He seemed ordinary, except for the vacant look he gave me as he climbed into the car. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He replied in a low voice, "A cabin at the end of Forest Road." It was a remote destination, far from any busy areas, a long trip, but it promised good pay. I decided it was worth it. The silence inside the car was unnerving. I tried making small talk, asking about the weather or why he was heading to such a secluded place on a night like this. He replied with monosyllables or faint nods, seemingly more interested in watching the snow fall through the window. As we drove deeper into the countryside, the road narrowed and became darker. My GPS started glitching, but he gave me precise directions, as though he knew the area intimately. When we finally arrived, a small cabin came into view, shrouded in darkness and snow. Its windows were dark, and there was no sign of other vehicles or people nearby. Something about the scene gave me a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "This is it," he said in a tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Before he got out, he reached for a suitcase from the seat beside him and placed it on the ground. That's when I noticed a red stain on the side of the suitcase, partially covered by the snow. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave me an odd smile. "Everything's exactly as it should be." Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me, and I asked what was in the suitcase. He shrugged. "Memories," he said before turning and walking slowly toward the cabin. I decided it wasn't my business, but as I reversed the car to leave, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man had stopped halfway to the cabin and was staring directly at me, as if he knew I was watching. He didn't move, just stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on mine. My heart pounded, and I floored the gas, sliding on the snowy road as I sped away. Back in the city, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, watching. I decided to call the police and report what had happened. At first, I thought they wouldn't take me seriously, but when I mentioned the location and the suitcase with the red stain, the dispatcher fell silent before saying, "Please hold." Shortly after, I got a call from a detective who asked me to meet them and guide them to the site. The next day, we returned to the cabin with a police team. It was empty, but what we found inside turned my stomach. There were bloodstains on the floor and table, and the suitcase he'd carried was open, filled with tools that seemed designed for torture. Even more horrifying was what we found in the basement, a small room with chains on the walls and remains that forensic experts later confirmed were human. The man was never found, but the police discovered he was linked to several disappearances in the region over the past few years. To this day, I can't forget the look he gave me in the rearview mirror, as if he knew I had narrowly escaped. Since then, I've avoided working night shifts and always refuse rides to isolated places, especially in winter. Because that night, I was lucky. And luck is something not everyone has. It was supposed to be a romantic trip to the mountains, far from the noise of the city. Clara, my wife, and I decided to explore a remote region known for its snowy landscapes. Everything was going well until an avalanche blocked access to the main road. The snow fell like a wall, trapping our car. With no other choice, we grabbed our backpacks and set off on foot, hoping to find help before the cold defeated us. That's when we spotted a house in the distance, hidden among snow-covered trees. The house looked abandoned, with dusty windows and an untouched layer of snow on the porch. Clara hesitated, but the freezing cold was unbearable, and going inside seemed like our only option. We pushed the door, and it creaked open with surprising ease. Inside, the house was rustic, filled with old furniture covered by sheets. The air was heavy, carrying a faint smell of mildew. We lit the fireplace with the little wood we found and tried to warm up. That's when Clara pointed out something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a dirty plate on the kitchen table. "If this place is abandoned, who left that here?" Clara asked in a hushed voice. I glanced around, trying to find an explanation. Maybe someone had recently used the house, I thought, but the eerie silence made me uneasy. We decided to explore the rest of the house. In one bedroom, we found a messy bed, as if someone had slept there recently. The closet door was slightly ajar, revealing clothes still hanging, and on the floor lay a pair of boots with fresh snow stuck to them. As we debated what to do next, a sound came from upstairs. It was faint, like shuffling footsteps. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way up the creaking stairs, every step amplifying my growing dread. Clara stayed in the living room, clutching a piece of firewood as a makeshift weapon. At the top, I found a narrow hallway with 2 doors. The first room was empty, but when I opened the second, I froze. A chair was positioned facing the window, with dirty handprints smudged on the windowsill. Whoever it was had been there, watching the snow. I rushed back to tell Clara we needed to leave, but when I returned to the living room, she was gone. The firewood she'd been holding lay discarded on the floor. Panic set in as I called her name, but the only response was silence. My hands shook as I searched the house, ignoring the increasing sensation of being watched. Then I heard her voice, faint and muffled, coming from the basement. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I hurried down the stairs, calling out to her. In the basement, I found Clara pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed to a dark corner where an old mattress lay surrounded by empty cans of food, a crumpled blanket, and a rusty knife. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "He's still here." Before I could respond, we heard the sound of something heavy descending the stairs. My flashlight wavered in my trembling hand as the noise grew closer. We didn't wait to find out who, or what, it was. We bolted upstairs and slammed the basement door shut, barricading it with everything we could find. Hearts pounding, we knew staying in the house was no longer an option. Braving the cold, we slipped out the back door and started trekking through the forest, ignoring the biting wind. Before long, I glanced back and saw a shadow in the upstairs window, watching us as we fled. The figure remained there until the darkness of the forest swallowed us. We reached a lodge the next day, where locals told us chilling stories about a man who lived alone in the mountains, stealing from abandoned homes and attacking those who trespassed on his territory. We never found out who he was or what his intentions were, but that night taught us a lesson we'll never forget: not every shelter is safe, and sometimes, it's better to face the cold than the secrets hidden in the warmth of an unfamiliar fireplace. On the morning after the strongest snowstorm of the year, I decided to go for a walk. The landscape was surreal, an endless white expanse that made the world feel like another planet. I enjoyed these solitary walks, they helped clear my mind. But that day, something shattered the tranquility, a trail of bloody footprints cutting across the pristine snow. They looked fresh, each step marked by drops of blood that starkly contrasted with the pure ground. My instincts told me to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks for about 20 minutes until they led me to a clearing surrounded by tall trees. In the center of the space was a mound of snow that seemed wrong. The reddish tint around it told me this was the end of the trail. Hesitant, I began digging with my hands. It didn't take long before I uncovered something that made my stomach turn, a piece of fabric, and just below it, the frozen face of a man. His eyes were glazed over, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. As I tried to process what I was seeing, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. My heart raced. I turned quickly to see 2 men, both dressed in heavy winter clothes but with expressions that didn't match the cold. One carried a shovel, while the other held a rifle pointed directly at me. "You shouldn't be here," the armed man said, his voice sharp. "This has nothing to do with you." I tried to explain that I was just out for a walk, that I didn't want any trouble, but they didn't seem interested. One of them grabbed a radio and started speaking to someone, mentioning my presence and what I had seen. The man with the shovel began covering the body again, while the other kept his eyes fixed on me, as if deciding what to do. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I said I was willing to forget everything, that I'd leave immediately and never tell anyone. The man with the rifle hesitated, and that was my chance. Without thinking, I ran toward the forest, their shouts echoing behind me. The sharp crack of a gunshot pierced the air, but I didn't stop to look back. I ran until my legs gave out and the frozen air burned my lungs. When I finally felt safe, I realized I was lost. The snow had erased any trace of the path I'd come from. I wandered for hours until I spotted the roof of a cabin in the distance. I knocked on the door, praying it was a safe place. An older man answered, his tired eyes wary but kind. After hearing my story, he simply shook his head and said, "You crossed paths with the wrong ones. They've been doing this for years, and no one dares to stop them." I never returned to that trail. The local news mentioned the snowstorm, but there was no word of bodies or disappearances. Since that day, I've been haunted by the image of that man's frozen eyes and the faces of my pursuers. Sometimes, when it snows at night, I think I see footprints near my window, but I never have the courage to check. I went to my grandmother's countryside cabin to disconnect. It was winter, and the cabin sat isolated on a snow-covered hill. At first, everything seemed peaceful. The fireplace kept the house warm, and the quiet of the countryside was a relief for my weary mind. But on the second night, things changed. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard footsteps outside. I got up and looked out the window, but all I saw was the snow shimmering under the moonlight. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But that same night, I heard knocking at the door. When I went to check, no one was there. The chill that ran down my spine was impossible to ignore. The situation worsened over the next few nights. The footsteps grew more frequent, the knocking louder. One night, I heard something scratching against the outer walls of the house. Summoning courage, I went outside with a flashlight to investigate, but all I found were strange marks in the snow. It was on the fourth night that I realized how serious the situation was. I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the house. My heart pounded as I got out of bed. I grabbed a piece of firewood from the hearth and went to check. Wet footprints on the floor left no doubt, someone had been inside. I searched every room but found no one. The door was locked, but the basement window was open. I decided I couldn't spend another night there. But when I went to grab my phone to call for help, it was gone. So were my keys. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but the house appeared empty, or so it seemed. The sound was now coming from the basement. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. Down there, the darkness was nearly complete. I switched on my flashlight and froze at what I saw, an old mattress, canned food, and a torn photo of me lying on the floor. I didn't think twice. I ran out of the house and bolted through the snow until I reached the main road. Hours later, a passing driver gave me a ride. When I told my story to the police, they investigated the cabin but found no one. Since then, I've never returned to that cabin. But sometimes, when it snows, I hear footsteps on my roof at night and wonder if that visitor is still looking for me. It was supposed to be a simple weekend hunting trip in the mountains. My friends, Mark and James, and I set up camp near a remote trail. The plan was to spend the night under the stars, but an unexpected snowstorm forced us to change course. We decided to search for shelter, and that's when we came across the cabin. It was a small, old structure, seemingly abandoned. But as we stepped inside, we realized someone had been there recently. The fireplace was still warm, clothes were scattered around, and there were open cans of food on the table. While debating whether to stay, we heard footsteps outside. A man entered suddenly, startling us all. He looked exhausted and was covered in snow. "Sorry, I didn't know anyone else was out here," he said with a tired smile. He claimed to have been lost since the last snowstorm and thanked us for keeping the fire going. Mark, always the skeptical one, muttered something about the situation feeling off. Despite our reservations, we shared some food and let the man stay. He told us a vague story about getting separated from his group but avoided giving any real details. Meanwhile, James began exploring the cabin and found something strange, a backpack with identification that didn't match the name the man had given us. When James showed it to Mark and me, we realized something was wrong. Mark started pressing the man for answers, but before we could get any, the man pulled a knife from his pocket and ordered us to stay quiet. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered coldly. The tension was suffocating, but we managed to distract him. While James pretended to comply, Mark lunged at the man, trying to disarm him. A struggle broke out, and the knife fell to the floor. The man bolted out the door and vanished into the snowstorm. We decided it wasn't safe to stay in the cabin and made our way back to our camp. Using a radio, we called for help. When the authorities arrived, we told them everything, and they seemed immediately concerned. It turned out the man matched the description of a fugitive wanted for a string of crimes in the area. A few days later, we learned that the cabin had been his hideout for years. I still get chills when I think about his eyes, the eerie calm before the violence. Since that day, I've avoided isolated trails. You never really know who, or what, you might come across out there. Our village was small, with fewer than 200 residents. Everyone knew each other, and winter nights were always peaceful. But that night, during the biggest snowstorm of the year, a blackout plunged everything into darkness. Temperatures dropped drastically, and the villagers gathered at the church, the only place with a wood-burning stove. As families huddled together for warmth, I noticed someone was missing, Mrs. Celia, the elderly woman who lived alone on the outskirts of the village. A group of us decided to check on her. When we arrived at her house, the lights were off, and the front door was slightly ajar. We called out her name as we stepped inside, but the silence was deafening. In her bedroom, we found signs of a struggle, overturned furniture and a trail of blood leading to the back door. The tracks led us to the village square, where the snow covered everything in a pristine blanket of white. That's where we found her body, partially buried in the ice. The deep cuts on her body made it clear, this was no accident. We rushed back to the church, where panic was spreading fast. Who could have done something like this? And more importantly, who among us could be the culprit? The tension in the room was palpable, especially when someone realized her husband was also missing. We decided to organize a search party, but as we prepared, a scream echoed from the church basement. We all ran down and found a man tied up and bleeding. He claimed he had been attacked and thrown there. Looking back, what chills me the most is the realization that the murderer was with us the entire time, blending into the crowd, listening to our conversations, and feeding off the chaos. By the time the sun rose the next day and the snow began to melt, the killer had vanished, taking the secrets of that terrible night with them. To this day, no one knows who it was. I'm a delivery driver in a mountainous region where the roads can be treacherous during winter. That morning, after a heavy snowstorm, I was struggling to navigate the icy roads when I spotted something in the middle of the road. It was a box, dirty and partially covered in snow. Thinking it might have fallen off a truck, I pulled over to check. The box was heavy, and there was something unsettling about it, dark stains along its sides. Against my better judgment, I decided to open it. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a blood-stained knife, a torn piece of fabric, and a wallet with an ID. The photo showed a man I didn't recognize, and the name wasn't familiar either. As I examined the wallet, I noticed it had an address inside. My first instinct was to take the package straight to the police, but as I drove, I realized I was being followed. A black car was trailing me, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I tried to speed up, but the icy roads made it impossible to outrun them. The car overtook me and blocked the road ahead. Two men got out and approached my truck. One of them said, "That doesn't belong to you," his voice cold and menacing as he gestured toward the box. I pretended to cooperate, handing over the package, but as they inspected its contents, I took the opportunity to escape. I drove as fast as I could until I reached an area with cell service and called the police. Later, I learned the ID in the wallet belonged to a man who had been missing for weeks. The two men who confronted me were connected to a network of violent crimes, and the box I found was a critical piece of evidence in their case. I often think about what might have happened if they'd caught me that day. Since then, I've learned to think twice before involving myself in something that isn't mine to handle. Sometimes, it's better to leave certain secrets buried in the snow.